Okay then, so we're nearly done now, but there's one last thing we need to do, and that's hook up this search form. So if I'm typing in some kind of search term like Mario, then what I want to do is somehow filter these to-dos so that only the to-dos which contain that still show. So when I talk about this, I'm talking about filtering these things. And when I use the word filter, I automatically think of the array method filter, which we used in the last chapter. So we're going to use the filter method to accomplish this, but I don't want you to think that that is the only way we can solve this problem. For any given problem in JavaScript, there's probably about 101 different solutions, probably more. And this is just one of those ways. So then, the first thing we need to do is listen to a key up event in this input field right here, because that's when we want to fire some kind of function. So whenever a user types something, a new letter in here, we're going to perform some kind of function. Now that function is going to be responsible for looking at this term and then trying to match it against whatever the text content of these to-dos is. Now if we do get a match, then really we don't want to do anything because we still want to show that on the screen. If we don't get a match, then what we want to do is hide that to-do. And we're going to do that by applying a class to the to-dos that don't match, and then that class will have a rule which hides it in the CSS. So then, let's get on with this. Let's do this event first of all. So at the bottom of the page, I've got this key up event comment, but before we do anything, we need to get a reference on this thing right here, this input field. Now we need to get a reference on the input field directly and not the search, because we're listening to a key up event on the input and not a submit event this time on the search form. So let's go and get this using this class and then the input inside it. So at the top, I'm going to say const search is equal to document.query selector. And then inside we want the search form first of all, then we want the input field inside it. Okay, cool. So now we have that reference. We can attach the key up event to this. So down at the bottom of the page, let's say now we want to get the search, which is the input, then add an event listener. The event we're listening for is the key up event, and inside we're going to fire some kind of function. So inside this function, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing we want to do is get the term that a user types in at that moment in time. So every time a user types a letter, this callback function is going to fire, and when it fires, I want to get whatever is currently in the input field at that moment in time. So the way we do that is by saying const, and we'll call this term, you can call it what you want, and set that equal to search, which is the input field itself. Then we get the value from that, the thing that the user has typed in, by using the value property. Then I'm going to use the trim method on it so that it trims off any white space. Okay, so now we have that term, what a user types in, and we're getting that every time they type a new key. So the next thing we want to do is write a function which is going to take this term and it's going to try and match it against the to-dos and filter those. So let's create that function above it. Now I'm creating this function outside of this callback function right here because it makes our code again more reusable, and if I want to use this function from somewhere else in the code in the future, it's going to let me do that. If I write all the logic directly inside this callback function, then it doesn't really make it reusable because then we can't call that from somewhere else. So we're going to write a function here, and this function is going to be called filter to-dos. So create a constant, call it filter to-dos, and set it equal to a function. It's going to take in the term which a user types in, which is ultimately this thing, and inside we're going to do something. So let's call that function down here. We'll say filter to-dos and pass in the term. So we're calling this function every time a user presses a key. So in here, all we'll do for now is log out this term. So console.log term. All right, so let's try this. I'm going to type out a term, and notice every time I type a new key, we're firing that function and getting this value logged to the console, and this matches up to whatever is in the input at that moment in time. So now we have that term. The next step is to somehow filter through the to-dos right here and apply classes to the ones that we don't want to show. And by that I mean apply classes to the ones which don't have a match with this, because they're the ones we want to hide. So We're going to use the filter method to do this, to filter through the to-dos. But first of all, we need a list of the to-dos. We need a reference to that. Now then, up at the top, we already have a reference to the list container. That is the UL tag that surrounds all of the to-dos. So this thing right here. So that there is the parent of each to-do, because each to-do is an LI tag. And we want a list of LI tags, a list of to-dos. So we can take the list and we can get the children from that list, which will be a collection of LI tags, a collection of to-dos, and we can use that. So let's come down here, and instead of logging out the term this time, let's take the list, which is the UL that we have a reference to, dot children, just to see what that is. Save it. We have to type a key to see this, and we see this list of LI tags. Now notice this is an HTML collection. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we can't use array methods directly on this. We've seen that in the past. However, what we can do is convert this into an array, and then we can use array methods on it like .filter or .forEach. So let's do this. Let's convert this into an array, and we do that by saying array.from. We've seen this in the past, and then passing in as a parameter to this from method what we want to turn into an array. So it takes this HTML collection and turns it into an array. So now we're logging that to the console. We should see an array when we type in a letter, which we do. And now if we expand the proto property, and don't worry too much what this is at the minute, but essentially it shows all the different methods we can use. And down here we can see we can now use the filter method, and we can also use forEach, which is here. Okay, so they're the two methods we do need to use. So what I'm going to do now is take away the console log, like so, and now we have this array of to-dos. Now I'm going to use the filter method on this. Now I'm not going to do it directly here because we're going to chain a few methods together, and when we chain methods together, it's more readable if we come underneath and then chain them underneath. So I'm going to use a filter method right here. Now inside this filter method, we need a callback function. So let me do that. So this filter method is going to go through all of the items, all of the to-dos in this list of LIs, and it's going to fire this callback function for each one. Now, remember the filter method returns us a new array, and that new array is going to be whatever items that we keep in it. Now, we keep an item in the array by returning true, and we filter an item out by returning false. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, we want to filter out the ones which don't have a match because we don't want to see those. But that's not what I want to do. I want to filter out the ones where we do have a match. So why do I want to do that? Well, ultimately what I'm going to do when I type something in here is look for the ones that don't have a match, like these two, if I type in Mario. And with those two, then I can apply a class to each one of them, which is going to hide those to-dos. So I want to filter out the one that does match because I don't want to do anything with that. I hope that makes sense. So then, what I'm going to do here is return something. And this is going to either be true or false. Now, before we return anything, we actually need to take in a parameter here, which refers to the individual item in the array as we iterate it. So I'll call this a to-do, and that's going to mean each of the LI tags basically as we take them in. And for each one, I want to return to-do.text content. And this text content is going to look at the actual text inside the span tag. It doesn't matter that we're using the property on the LI tag because this text is still inside the LI tag. We don't have to do it directly on the span. We can do it on the LI tag and it still looks at any text inside that in here. Now this is the only text in there, so it's going to try and match it against that. And in fact, what I'll do is instead of returning something for now, let me just log to the console. So I'll say console.log and we'll log out to-do.text content. And I'm just going to return true for now to keep everything in the array. Now, if we save this and if I type out M, we can see this is the text content right here. So what we're ultimately going to do is compare the term against the text content. Okay, so now we can get rid of these things. I'm going to return to-do.textContent. Then I'm going to use a method called includes, which we've seen before. this searches a string to see if it includes a certain term, and we have that term which we want to check. So if I paste that in there now, then this is what we're returning. This is going to be either true or false. Now then, this is going to be true if that particular to-do contains the term, and so it's going to keep that in the array. Now I want the opposite of this. I only want items to be kept in the array if they don't include the term. So I can negate what's returned here. I can reverse it by putting the exclamation mark in front of it. Remember, we've seen this. This negates a Boolean. So if this is true, then it's going to turn it to false. If this is false, it's going to turn it to true. So now this new array that we get back from the filter method is going to include only to-dos which don't include the term, because we've placed that there. And that's what we want. We want an array of to-dos which don't contain the term, because then what we can do is we can cycle through this array using a for each and apply a class to each one of those in that array. And that class in a CSS sheet is going to hide those to-dos. I hope that makes sense. So this is our filter method done here. Now, because this is one line, we can shift it up to one line on here. So let's delete those things and delete those things as well. And now we have that on one line. So this is returning the array that we need. And now we can cycle through that array using for each. So inside this, again, we need a callback function. And this is where, inside here, we're going to apply a class to each one. Let's spell for each correctly first of all. So we still take the to-do like this, and then we take that to-do and we can say class list, then dot add, and the class we're going to add is filtered. Okay, now again, if we want, even though we're not returning anything here, we can still bring this up to one line. So we can bring this up to there, and we can bring this up to there. Now it's going to return this value, but it doesn't matter, it's still doing what we want. So now we're getting all of the to-dos inside the array that don't include that term. Then for each one of them, we're applying a filtered class to it. So let's test this out. And what I'm going to do is just inspect an element over here so that we can see all of these different li tags, these different to-dos. Now, if I start to type something in, for example, M, then notice this middle one gets a class of filtered, because what we're doing is cycling through these using the filter method, and we're filtering out anything which does include this term, and we're only left with this. And then we're applying a class to that, filtered. So later in the CSS, we'll make a rule for this CSS class to hide this one. Now, if I type MA, nothing else happens because MA is here and MA is also here. But if I type MAR, then we get a class of filtered at the bottom, because MAR is not in this, but it is in this. Okay, so that works, but there's one thing wrong. If I then delete R, then this at the bottom still has a class of filtered. And it shouldn't do, because MA and MA, they match. So we need a way to do the opposite of what we've just done to remove classes when we get a match. So what I'm going to do is actually copy all of this. Let me just make a little more space so it's more readable. Then paste it in. So we're still getting an array from list.children, and we're still going to filter through each one. This time, I want to get a new filtered array which contains all of the elements that do match, because when they do match, I want to remove that filtered class. So I want the opposite of this. So I can just remove that. And now we get a filtered array of elements or to-dos which do contain that term. So now we have those, we can use for each to cycle through them, and for each one of those, we're going to remove the filtered class because we no longer want to hide those. So when we get a match now, we're taking that class back off. So if we save this and preview, I'm going to type MA, and notice currently this one is filtered, MAR, and this one becomes filtered. Now if I delete one, we get rid of the filtered here because we get a match, and if I delete 2 and 3, then we delete the filtered here because now it matches all of them. So now we have the JavaScript functionality done. The only thing left to do is make this filtered class rule in the CSS. So let's say .filtered, and when an element has this class, we want to say the display is going to be none, and that's important to overwrite any other class it might have or any other style it might have. So let's save that, And now let's test this out. I'm going to say PLA and we get that one. If I take one of these away, anything with a P in it, if I say defeat, we can see that one. And this is also going to work if we add some more. So let me say buy milk and buy bread and make the bed and buy flowers, etc. And I've spelled bed wrong, but whatever. If we now start to say BUY, we get everything with buy. And if we start to delete, then we can see more. We can also delete these ones and it's still going to work. So FLO for flowers, etc. So now we have a fully functioning search form at the top of our to-do list. Now, like I said, this was just one way of accomplishing this task, and there are other ways to do it as well. The reason I chose to use the filter method right here inside this function is because we've just been looking at array methods in the last chapter, and I wanted to do some practice with different array methods and array method chaining. So that's why I chose this way, but guaranteed, if you give this problem to 10 different developers, they'll all come back with a different solution. So if you want, play around with this, try and come up with your own solutions. This is just one of them. But actually, there is one other problem with this, which I've just remembered. And that is, if we type something up here, for example, in capitals, play Mario Kart, then it doesn't come up with that to do. Now, that's because this is in capitals and the one on the to-do list isn't. And remember, when we compare those two things, capital string with a non-capital string using strict equality, then it's not going to get a match. They're not the same thing. So what we could do is convert everything to lowercase first of all, so that when we're comparing them, we're comparing lowercase with lowercase. So if they type something in capitals, we could get that value, then we could trim it, then we could say to lowercase like this, and then we have that term in lowercase. But then also we want to get the text content from here, just in case they enter it in uppercase over here, for example, buy milk. That's going to be stored in uppercase over here. So what we could do is take this and convert it to lowercase as well over here. So we'll say to lowercase like that. And we'll do exactly the same thing for the text content down here like that. And now we're comparing lowercase with lowercase. We're converting everything first. So if I now start to type play, then we still get a match, even though one is in capitals and one is not in capitals. And the same goes for this. If I say buy milk, that's in capitals, and I search up here in lowercase, then we still get a match because we're converting everything first of all. So, there we go, my friends. That is the to-do list completely done now, and it's time to move on to the next chapter.